welcome on this short video that we've been able to record as part of our CSAE Conference. My name is Stefan Dercon. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, and I'm very pleased that I will be able to briefly talk to Abebe Aemro Selassie, who is the director of the African Department for the International Monetary Fund. He oversees all the operations and engagement with 45 countries. He has a 20-year career with the IMF. He's an Ethiopian national, studied at the LSE, and before joining the IMF also advised the Ethiopian government. He was going to be our keynote at the conference, but he's very kindly to give a little bit of his time while they're all working very hard in Washington to try to deal with the crisis. And I just have a few questions. So welcome, Abebe, here this afternoon.
Thank you, Stefan, very much.
Okay, so I just will ask you a few questions. And the first one is really, so how do you think COVID-19 will impact on the economies of Africa?
Stefan, I mean, this is something we're thinking very deeply about and working on assessing. But from everything that we've seen, the experience of other countries, this is something that's going to have a really very adverse impact on the economies of many countries in the region. Specifically, there probably are, three channels through which we are going to see the impact in the region. I think first and foremost, of course, this is a health crisis, a human, the human toll that this threatens to exact in the region in many countries. So that is really something that we're deeply worried about, particularly given the weak health infrastructure in the region. Of course, the measures that countries in recent days have been taking to close borders, to practice social distancing, etc., are not necessarily going to be very straightforward in many of our countries, given people have to, the options for working from home are just not there for vast majority of people, for people in the informal sector. You know how small the formal sector is. So that's going to be very disruptive to social lives and livelihoods, in addition to the health crisis. So we worry about the propagation in the region, in the crowded urban areas being very strong. So there is that dimension that is going to be impacting countries, and we're very worried about. We're very pleased to see that countries have been adopting measures fairly quickly to get on top of the crisis, but still the way in which this has been spreading, it really is very worrisome. So there is a health and human toll, and what countries need to do to address that. So that's the first channel. Second channel, of course, is the health crisis has morphed into an economic crisis globally. I mean, you see how it's been sweeping country after country. And we are looking globally at a very significant slowdown, if not a recession. So this global slowdown is going to reduce demand for African commodities, delay investment decisions that are going to have to be made. So that channel is going to be also a very important source of headwinds for many countries in the region. All the more so because countries are increasingly more integrated than they were, say, in 2009. So much more reliance on global capital markets, much more reliance on China, for example, for trade. So that is going to be a second important channel of a very important adverse shock for many countries. And then third important thing that we're seeing, a channel, is for the oil exporting countries in the region. The sharp slump in oil prices, basically back to levels we have not seen since the early 2000s, is going to be compound the first two effects. So the 8 or so countries that are oil exporters, this will be a very significant adverse hit for them also. So these are the channels through which we see the region being impacted, and the impact is likely to be very pronounced.
Okay, so thank you. just to follow up on that, what would you now advise to African governments, finance ministries, central banks? How should they try to respond at this stage?
So, first and foremost, of course, is making sure that you help people cope with this health crisis that our countries are facing. So, this is not the time for half measures, and all priority has to be, the priority has to be really focusing on suppressing the illness, the spread of the illness, treating people, and reallocating spending to boost health systems to fight this disease. Without that, frankly, nothing else is going to work anyway. So the priority has to be on this. I've been saying this is not the time for half measures. This is really imperative that we tackle this the health crisis that's is threatening countries, and so no time for complacency, full out effort to tackle that. So that's the first priority. On the economic front, we see this hopefully as a one-off shock. That strongly argues for countries basically using fiscal policy to accommodate the impact of the shock. So we feel, automatic stabilizers, as it were, should be allowed to operate. And most countries, of course, have limited fiscal space, limited debt-bearing capacity. But we feel like this year there is a need for deficits to widen to accommodate this shock, and then reverting, fiscal paths, reverting back to what's needed to anchor medium-term debt considerations, financing considerations, going out from next year onwards or so. So, really accommodating the shock is going to be very important part of the fiscal response. Protecting livelihoods as much as possible, we see that as very important policy response. There is, of course, scope also on the monetary policy side to help ease. In some cases, particularly countries with flexible exchange rates, there could be a lot more scope to do that. Frankly, rather than bleeding reserves, allowing rates to adjust is also part of the response, and protecting the real sector some, using the exchange rate as a shock absorber. We see scope for that. And frankly, also, some consideration will need to be given where there is scope for targeted intervention. Sectors like tourism are going to be hit really, really hard. So there's a whole bunch of policies that countries have been adopting elsewhere, and we've been documenting and providing advice on, such as temporary tax credits and the like, to be used in a very targeted way, and in a temporary way, of course, to support sectors that are going to be hard hit by all of the measures that are taking place. So a fairly comprehensive and robust policy response is needed at this time.
Clearly, a lot of these countries don't really have much of fiscal space, as you're already alluding to. There's also other things maybe that the international community could do, and in particular the IMF. What do you think, what is the nature of the response the IMF is likely to have relative to sub-Saharan African and African countries in general?
So indeed, so this is exactly our role as an international financial institution, particularly the IMF, of course, is to step forward and provide the financing countries need, particularly at a time like this when market financing is not available, when economic crisis hit. So we're moving very, very aggressively to support any and every country that is requesting assistance as quickly as possible also. The managing director has announced a package of 50 billion, up to 50 billion, that we can make available in a very, very quick way to the membership. About 10 billion of this is for low income, the lower income countries in the region. So at the moment, we're entertaining quite a few requests for rapid financing, and we're working on that. And this, as I noted earlier, is all the more important because we expect countries to deal with the shock by accommodating, by a more accommodative fiscal policy position. It's important that the financing is available for countries at this juncture. So we're working very, very hard, I can tell you, with every country that's made a request to be as supportive as we can, and making sure that over the medium term, once this crisis is behind us, we can go back to getting countries back to the medium-term growth, medium-term fiscal framework paths. But I think the immediate effort has to be to try and address this awful crisis that we're all contending with.
It's very good, and I promise you will get the invitation to come and address us in person.
Thank you.
Next year or even sooner if we start making other arrangements. I'm very much appreciate the time you took now to talk to us, and good luck with your endeavors in the next few weeks at the IMF. So Abebe, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan.
Okay.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thanks.